Lesson 7. Behavioral and social therapy, healing from the bottom up. After biological stabilization and calming of the mind, the treatment of depression cannot remain confined to the internal level. Even the most carefully chosen pharmacotherapy and the most effective regulatory techniques do not yet restore the capacity to be present in the world. Depression is not only a mental state, but also a process of gradual withdrawal from relationships, roles, and responsibilities. Without rebuilding this dimension, recovery remains incomplete. Social therapy constitutes the third pillar of treatment because it addresses the area that deteriorates most profoundly in depression: natural contact with other people and the sense of belonging. The illness promotes isolation, narrowing of perspective, and fixation on one's own suffering. Community, understood not as a crowd, but as a real space of relationships, works in the opposite direction. It shifts attention outward, restores the rhythm of life, and places the individual within a context larger than themselves. The goal of social therapy is not activation for the sake of action, nor a return to form measured by productivity. Its essence lies in regaining a safe place among others, where presence does not require a mask, competition, or constant self-evaluation. Unlike psychotherapy, which focuses on inner experiences, social therapy operates through experience, through real participation in something that exists outside the patient's mind. It is also important to recognize that social therapy is not a universal solution and cannot be applied at every stage of the illness. Without prior biological stabilization and regulation of the nervous system, contact with other people may be overwhelming and lead to further withdrawal. This is why this pillar of treatment appears only at this stage, as a consequence of achieved stability, not as a prerequisite for it. 1. Depression as withdrawal from relationships and social life. One of the most characteristic, yet least understood, symptoms of depression is gradual withdrawal from social relationships. This process does not begin with a conscious decision to isolate, but with a loss of energy required to sustain contact, conversation, and social roles. What once felt natural begins to demand effort disproportionate to its benefits. Relationships cease to provide relief and instead become a source of fatigue and tension. In depression, contact with others often evokes a sense of being out of place. The person feels emotionally out of sync, as if they must pretend or explain their condition. Over time, a belief emerges that it is better to withdraw, to avoid burdening others or exposing oneself to misunderstanding. Isolation, in this sense, is not a whim or a lack of desire for social life, but a defensive mechanism intended to protect the remaining psychological energy. The problem is that withdrawal from relationships functions as a vicious circle. The less contact with people there is, the stronger the narrowing of perspective and the focus on one's own experiences becomes. The mind remains confined to the same thoughts and emotions, without natural corrective stimuli. Social roles that once organized identity, being part of a team, a family, a community, begin to disappear. A person stops being someone in relation and becomes only a oneself in illness. Depression not only weakens the capacity for relationships, but also distorts their perception. Neutral behaviors of others are interpreted as judgment, distance, or rejection. The individual ceases to experience relationships as a safe space for emotional regulation and begins to perceive them as a potential threat. In such circumstances, further withdrawal appears rational, even though it actually deepens the problem. From a therapeutic perspective, it is crucial to understand that depression cannot be effectively worked through in isolation alone. Even the most profound inner work, conducted without a return to relationships, remains incomplete. Human beings are social not only culturally, but biologically. Contact with others regulates emotions, restores a sense of continuity, and anchors the person in reality. For this reason, social therapy is not an optional add-on or a luxury, but a necessary element of recovery. Its task is not the immediate socialization of the patient, but the gradual reversal of the withdrawal process. Before conscious engagement in relationships becomes possible, however, it is necessary to understand why forced activation often causes harm, and why the pace and form of social contact are of fundamental importance in depression. This will be the subject of the next section. 2. Social activation versus compulsion to act. One of the most common mistakes in the treatment of depression is confusing social therapy with forced activation. Acting in good faith, the patient is often encouraged, or forces themselves, to go out among people, attend meetings, or take on social roles for which their nervous system is not yet ready. The effect is often the opposite of what was intended. Instead of improvement, overload appears, followed by a sense of failure and further withdrawal. Activation that heals does not consist in increasing intensity, but in restoring contact in a regulated way. In depression, the basic criterion of effectiveness is not the number of interactions or their duration, but the sense of safety within the relationship. If social contact requires constant emotional control, explanations, or pretending to be normal, it becomes another source of stress. Such stress does not build health, it consumes it. Compulsion to act is particularly destructive because it activates mechanisms already present in the illness itself: excessive self-control, comparison with others, and evaluation of one's own inefficiency. The patient begins to treat relationships like a test that must be passed. Every setback, fatigue from conversation, leaving early, lack of satisfaction, is interpreted as proof of personal failure. In this way, activation reinforces the depressive narrative instead of weakening it. Being in a situation that feels uncomfortable generates frustration, and psychological exhaustion implies a need to escape and hide. Instead of treatment, it consolidates maladaptive social assimilation. Social therapy works when contact is an invitation rather than a forced task. The social environment must be adjusted to the patient's adaptive capacity and aligned with their current potential for integration. The point is not to do more, but to gradually restore the ability to be with others without excessive emotional cost. Sometimes this means a very limited form of participation, brief presence, a passive role, a relationship based on shared being rather than conversation or expression. This is still social contact, and often exactly the kind that heals at a given stage. It is also important to distinguish between social activity and social exposure to evaluation. Depression lowers tolerance for being observed and judged. Therefore, forms of contact based on competition, self-presentation, or comparison are often particularly burdensome. Social therapy should minimize these elements rather than intensify them. In practice, this means that the pace and form of activation must be tailored to the patient's current level of regulation. What is therapeutic at one stage may be harmful at another. The key question is therefore not, is the patient doing something, but rather, how does their nervous system respond to this contact? 3. Matching social contact to emotional sensitivity. The effectiveness of social therapy in depression depends not on the mere fact of contact with other people, but on how well that contact is matched to the patient's individual emotional sensitivity. Depression is not a uniform state. In some people, withdrawal and numbness dominate; in others, hypersensitivity, rapid overload by stimuli, and intense emotional reactions prevail. What is neutral or supportive for one person may be a source of significant stress for another. In depression, the threshold for social tolerance is often markedly reduced. Contact that was once natural begins to consume an excessive amount of psychological energy. For this reason, social therapy cannot be based on uniform recommendations such as more meetings or go out among people more often. Such an approach ignores the fact that excessive social exposure can be just as harmful as total isolation. Matching contact means, above all, taking into account the form of the relationship. For many people with depression, asymmetrical or limited relationships are much safer, those in which one does not have to constantly present oneself, explain oneself, or respond to the other person's emotions. This may involve jointly performing simple tasks, being in someone's presence without the need for conversation, or contact based on a clearly defined role. Such relationships reduce tension because they do not require constant self-monitoring. Equally important is the size and intensity of contact. For some patients, one-to-one relationships or very small groups are safer. Large gatherings, a high density of stimuli, and the need for rapid social adaptation can lead to overload and symptom exacerbation. Social therapy does not consist in forcibly breaking through these boundaries, but in respecting them and gradually expanding them, provided the nervous system allows it. Matching also means taking emotional resonance into account. Social contact heals when the patient experiences at least a minimal sense of meaning or coherence in what they are doing. Social activity devoid of significance, performed solely because one should, not only fails to help but often deepens the sense of emptiness. Emotional sensitivity requires that the relationship or social role somehow correspond to the patient's inner world. Understanding these mechanisms helps avoid one of the most serious systemic errors, judging the patient through the lens of their ability to function socially. Depression is not a deficit of character or social skills, but a state of reduced tolerance for stimuli and relationships. Social therapy is meant to rebuild that tolerance, not to test it. Only on such an individually matched foundation does it become possible to introduce the next therapeutic element, social responsibility and a sense of being needed, which, when properly chosen, can have a stabilizing effect and restore meaning. For social responsibility and the sense of being needed. One of the strongest, and at the same time most subtle, healing factors in depression is the sense of being needed. This is not about responsibility understood as pressure, obligation, or the expectation of meeting standards, but about the experience that one's presence has real significance. In depression, this experience almost completely disappears. A person stops seeing themselves as someone who contributes something to the world and begins to see themselves solely as a burden. Social responsibility, understood therapeutically, has a stabilizing effect because it shifts the point of reference beyond one's own symptoms. Attention no longer revolves exclusively around well-being, energy, or mood, but becomes anchored in a relationship and a role. This anchoring does not need to be large or spectacular. On the contrary, within depression, the safest forms are small, concrete, and predictable responsibilities that do not require constant evaluation or competition. The key distinction is between responsibility and pressure. Pressure is based on expectations and fear of judgment. Therapeutic responsibility is based on trust and simplicity. Someone relies on me, but does not expect perfection. My presence matters, even if I am not in my best condition. This experience rebuilds a basic sense of self-worth in a way that cannot be achieved through conversation or analysis alone. In practice, social responsibility can take many forms: a small, regular role within a group, helping with simple tasks, caring for something or someone within clearly defined limits. What matters is that the scope of responsibility is clearly defined and stable, rather than fluctuating and dependent on mood. Predictability protects the nervous system from additional stress. Responsibility also works because it restores continuity of time. Depression disrupts the sense of the future. Each day becomes a series of states to be endured. Even a minor responsibility introduces a reference point for tomorrow, for later, for someone. This subtle yet crucial shift in perspective provides psychological stabilization. At the same time, boundaries must be clearly stated. Responsibility cannot be imposed or used as a tool of mobilization. Excessive commitments, deadline pressure, or responsibility for other people's emotions easily lead to overload and guilt. Social therapy works only when responsibility strengthens a sense of meaning rather than fear of failure. At this stage of treatment, social responsibility prepares the ground for fuller forms of engagement with the world. Before moving on to specific cases of behavioral therapy, however, it is necessary to clarify the concept of social therapy itself, its forms, mechanisms of action, and limitations. This will be the subject of the next section. 5. Social therapies, forms, mechanisms, and limitations. Social therapies do not constitute a single method or a closed therapeutic protocol. They are a category of interventions whose common denominator is healing through real participation in social life, rather than through analysis of inner experiences. Their strength lies in moving the process of recovery beyond the patient's mind and embedding it in the lived experience of being part of something larger. Social therapies may include various forms of activity, volunteering, support groups, local communities, actions undertaken for the benefit of others, as well as auxiliary roles within institutions or organizations. They are not therapeutic because someone labels them as such, but because they activate specific regulatory mechanisms that cannot be achieved in isolation. The first of these mechanisms is the shift of attention away from the self. Depression intensifies focus on one's own states, symptoms, and difficulties. Social therapy naturally disrupts this pattern by directing attention toward a task, a relationship, or another person's needs. This does not eliminate suffering, but it reduces its dominance over the entire field of awareness. The second mechanism is the restoration of a social role. Depression deprives a person of a sense of place and function. Social therapies offer roles that are understandable, grounded in reality, and independent of momentary mood. Being someone who helps, someone who participates, or someone who is present rebuilds identity in a way that cannot be replaced by reflection alone. The third mechanism is natural emotional regulation through relationship. Contact with other people, provided it is safe and free of pressure, has a stabilizing effect on the nervous system. Emotions are regulated not through technique, but through presence, rhythm, and the repetition of interactions. This is a primary, biologically rooted form of regulation. At the same time, social therapies have their limitations and risks. They are not suitable at every stage of depression. In individuals who are biologically unstable or severely emotionally overloaded, they may lead to further withdrawal, a sense of failure, or symptom exacerbation. Equally problematic are forms of social therapy based on competition, evaluation, comparison, or high demands. Instead of healing, they reproduce the pressure that often contributed to the illness in the first place. It is also important to distinguish between community and social exposure. Being among people does not always mean being in relationship. Crowds, anonymity, and lack of structure can deepen the sense of loneliness. Social therapy requires a context in which the patient's presence matters, even if it is minimal. For this reason, social therapies should be treated as precise tools rather than universal solutions. They work best when they are carefully matched to the patient's sensitivity, embedded in a stable context, and introduced gradually. In this form, they become a natural completion of the regulatory process and a preparation for deeper forms of engagement, including the particular case of behavioral therapy, which requires separate discussion. 6. Integrating the three pillars from stabilization to meaning. Social therapy does not operate in a vacuum. Its effectiveness depends directly on the stage of treatment at which it is introduced and on how it is positioned in relation to the other two pillars. Pharmacology stabilizes the nervous system from within, regulation and calming organize psychological functioning from above, and social therapy initiates movement and relationship from below. Only together do they form a system capable of bearing the weight of depression. If any one of these pillars is omitted, the whole structure loses balance. Social therapy without biological stabilization often ends in overload and withdrawal. Pharmacology without regulation and relationship leads to passive functioning and relapse. Regulation without re-entry into the world can turn into a safe but barren isolation. Treating depression is therefore not about choosing a single path, but about continuously fine-tuning the proportions between these three domains. In practice, this process is not linear. There are periods when pharmacotherapy predominates, others when regulation becomes central, and moments when the focus of treatment shifts toward relationships and action. A patient may move back and forth between the pillars, and may even temporarily step away from one of them when their condition requires it. This is not a failure of therapy, but a natural dynamic of recovery. Integrating the three pillars also means that each one prepares the ground for the next. Pharmacology makes calming possible. Calming makes contact possible. Contact makes meaning possible. Social therapy, as the third pillar, does not replace earlier treatment, but gives it direction. Through it, improvement ceases to be merely a reduction of symptoms and becomes a genuine return to life. In this sense, social therapy functions as a bridge between treatment and existence. It addresses the question that eventually arises for most patients: why recover at all? Without relationships, responsibility, and meaning, this question remains unanswered, and clinical improvement alone may be insufficient to sustain long-term change. This lesson completes the third pillar of depression treatment, presenting it as part of a larger whole rather than as an autonomous method. Summary: depression is not merely a mood disorder or a problem confined to the mind. It is a process of gradual withdrawal from relationships, roles, and the social world. For this reason, treatment that ends with biological stabilization and internal regulation remains incomplete. Social therapy constitutes the third pillar of recovery because it restores what depression erodes first: real participation in life. This lesson has shown that effective social therapy is not about forced activation or a return to normality measured by productivity. Its essence lies in gradual, safe re-entry into relationships, adapted to the patient's emotional sensitivity. Social contact heals only when it is not a source of pressure, evaluation, or overload, but a space of regulation and meaning. A particularly important role is played by social responsibility, understood not as obligation, but as the experience of being needed. Small, stable roles restore a sense of worth and continuity of time, both of which depression systematically undermines. Social therapies operate through mechanisms that cannot be replaced by conversation or introspection alone, shifting attention beyond the self, rebuilding identity, and natural emotional regulation through relationship. This lesson also emphasizes the limits of social therapy. Without prior stabilization and calming, contact with others can be harmful. Treating depression requires a balance of three pillars: pharmacology, regulation, and relationship. Only their integration leads not only to symptom relief, but to the recovery of meaning in life.